sounded like that. That sounds great. See if I can share my screen here as well. Just to share that with whomever doesn't have it. So, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for inviting me and to the committee members. Just as a, be sure.
Your mic is
And what I won't be doing is sharing a whole pile of slides. I promise that. It's just a couple of pointed visuals which I wanted to share. Absolutely. So thanks again. Jim Boyd, I'm a neurologist from the University of Vermont, professor of neurology. I've been with the university now for 22 years as a Parkinson's specialist. I'm a trained neurologist and especially trained in movement disorders, which is collectively Parkinson's-related conditions. So I have really made a 22-year career out of treating Parkinson's disease here in Vermont. I've been here my entire career. I'm the director of the Parkinson Center at UVM, which we founded in 2013, director of, and have been the lead researcher there in a variety of different capacities of research, including disease-modifying therapies, condition slowing treatments, which we were exploring, ways to treat early Parkinson's disease, ways to treat advanced Parkinson's disease, which would slip up and beyond what we could control with standard medications. And so, dozens of studies later and lots of hours of work. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where we don't have any cure for Parkinson's disease. For those who aren't familiar with it, and I hope that many of you are, sadly, it's a common condition. That's the second most common neurodegenerative disorder after Alzheimer's disease. It creates a combination of symptoms, which I think the ones that are most recognizable, people think of tremor as Parkinson's disease, but it causes progressive loss of mobility, balance, stiffness, slowness, and generally a gradual move toward incapacity physically. We have medicines which can help with symptoms, particularly in the early stages, but as it gets more advanced, it really becomes challenging to maintain someone's physical function. What many people aren't familiar with is what we consider the non-movement or non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's, which 75% will become demented, and at least 40 up to 50% will develop hallucinations and other psychosis, mostly visual hallucinations. Again, these are relatively treatable, but with limitations to the ability to control those symptoms and maintain control of movement. When we're trying to control movement symptoms with fueling hallucinations, we're fueling confusion. A large proportion of them will develop dysautonomia. This is the autonomic functions of the body. So blood pressure regulation, heart rate, bladder control, bowel control, all become malfunctioned as part of the condition. So people are unable to stand because the blood pressure becomes low. They're unable to regulate and control their bladder. They become profoundly constipated in the condition. So that's really what we're often dealing with over the course of a very long condition. So from the time of diagnosis to death, average 12 to 15 years. The older one gets it, the shorter your lifespan is. It is a condition that many people just live many, many decades with, rather than die immediately from. And that sort of leads to more disability than it does death, but there's a large proportion of life expectancy change when someone gets it at a young age. So if you get Parkinson's in your 40s, which is a less common situation, then your life will be shortened by it. If you get it in your 80s, you will live with it, but it will disable you over your final years of life. And we don't have a way to stop that progression. When the condition starts, it will continue to get worse over each year, over that time frame. We really are just trying to contain symptoms and maintain people's level of function. one of the things that's important is that it is an age-related condition. It is in a higher prevalence, as far as we can understand, in rural states. We have epidemiologically linked that to agricultural proximity. And Vermont is well within what we expect for a rural state in terms of the prevalence of the condition. We have an overwhelming number of people with Parkinson's in the state, enough so that, again, I've been here working since 2005, and every few years we're adding another Parkinson's specialist because we can't keep up with the number of referrals. We have well over a year wait list to see people with Parkinson's disease for a new diagnosis, and can barely get them in for their follow-ups as we stand. So we're really, as a health system, are overwhelmed with the amount of Parkinson's we have already.
Question, Representative Nelson.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Boyd, and have you tracked, are these lifelong Vermonters? Have they lived here many years, or have they just moved here from other states? I've looked at your maps, and it pertains to paraquat, paraquat's used a lot as a desiccant in cotton and peanuts. And, I was surprised to see Vermont being dark blue, as is Minnesota and Iowa. But when I look down at those states where they grow peanuts and cotton, the incidence isn't as high. And so and maybe your talk isn't related to paraquat, but I had that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think what we don't have is we lack a state registry. So we do not have a good understanding of even how many people with residents in Vermont have Parkinson's disease. It's part of a separate effort that we need to put forward to understand where they are, where they have come from, what their exposures have been, and to understand what our relative need in terms of care delivery will be over time. In terms of the maps which I provided from some of the literature, this is really just looking to make an argument that this is not a non-Vermont problem. And these maps are not intended to justify that there's a paraquat reason in play. And we'll talk a little more about that. But what I just wanted to emphasize is that we have one of the highest all-risk mortality rate for Parkinson's disease of anywhere in the country. And all risk.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, we can't have, we have to keep the questions from the committee.
Sorry.
After the conversation, you can perhaps chat outside.
Yeah, so mortality is related to Parkinson's disease as high as anywhere else in the country. When we look at what we call disease or disability adjusted years of life, this is the number of years that you are disabled from said condition and the years of life lost because you have died earlier than expected. And when you add those together and you look at where the map distributions are, Vermont is the second highest in the country, only after Maine and Hawaii. And again, we're not explaining cause here. We're just, the emphasis is, this is a global problem. It's just, this is very much a Vermont problem as much as it is anywhere else, if not more. When we look at this disability adjusted life years.
I'm sorry, we had another question here, Representative O'Brien.
Yeah, just, you may even get into it, but my brother-in-law was just diagnosed with Parkinson's, just turned 70 last week. And he got a call last week for a Parkinson's study, but it was related to genetic Parkinson's, at which he doesn't have it in his family. So I wondered, does that also relate to rural areas where maybe there's less movement and it's passed on from generation to generation?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think as a collective, we can say that roughly on average, somewhere around 25 to 30% of cause of Parkinson's is contributed to by genetics. And of all the genetic disorders which we're aware of, yes, there are some which are what we consider dominantly inherited, where it's like 1 to 2% of all Parkinson's. I get it. My siblings, 50% of them will have it. One of my parents had it, half of their siblings had it, and it follows a lineage. But more importantly, it's most of the genes are what we call susceptibility genes. They increase your likelihood of getting it. But I can carry the gene and my brother can carry it. I will get it and he doesn't. And I think when we look at the evidence for twin studies, where we have identical twins which shared immediate shared genetics, there's a 30% relative identified genetic risk. That's the highest that we can find. Most of the time, we quote somewhere around 20 to 25% can be genetically underpinned. But I think the tough part is that of those, we think it's an interplay between genetic risk and environmental cause. And there's very good evidence to suggest that carrying a certain gene and then being exposed to said environmental exposure is going to increase your risk. And so,
Representative Bartholomew.
Yeah, really understand what these numbers mean. The sort of the one before that, the numbers on the right, I guess it relates to the next slide too.
sure. So these are the number of years of disability plus the years of life lost per 10,000 people. So we're looking at essentially how many years of lost function or life have people had related to Parkinson's disease in those distributions.
10,000. 10,000 people. Right.
And so in terms of the overall prevalence of Parkinson's in the population, the incidence is 1 in 100. As it's an age-related condition, 1 in 100 over a lifetime. If we looked at people who make it to the age of 80, it then goes to 2 in 100. So it doubles just based on pure successful aging. What we're looking here is this is the same exact reference that I'm providing. And what we're looking at is just different conditions. So I could have shown you a map of all of those different nice colors for each of these conditions here: stroke, migraine, Alzheimer's, all different neurological conditions. What we see with all of the other ones is they're either reducing over time or they're staying neutral. And it's not what we're seeing for Parkinson's disease between 1990 and 2015. It's actually accelerating over time. So we're having an increased incidence of these conditions. And in terms of the age-adjusted life years, it's not necessarily life-shortening, but people are potentially just living longer with the condition. But the overall burden of the disease state on people and collectively on the society is increasing over time. So this isn't saying that this image is not saying the incidence is increasing so much as it is people are living a long time and are just living in a disabled state for a longer time. So in terms of the discussions of paraquat, what I am not going to try to portray myself as some type of an herbicide chemist or somebody who understands volatility. I'm someone who's treated Parkinson's disease for 22 years and have had to see how devastating it is for people to have to live with it and what the negative effect is on their livelihood, their well-being, the burdens on their families and their spouses, and what the overall stress on the system is relative to the number of people with Parkinson's. So I have to guesstimate, I've probably seen thousands of people with Parkinson's disease at this point. And having done this in the state of Vermont as long as I have, I think I have met more people with Parkinson's disease in the state of Vermont than probably anybody. So there's my bias that I know a lot of people who have had Parkinson's and since passed or that have it currently. In terms of the paraquat story, I think the basic science of it is very logical. So the dopamine cells, which are responsible for the cause of physical symptoms of Parkinson's disease, are highly susceptible to anything that's an oxidative stress. So anything that's a mitochondrial toxin, so negatively affects the sort of energy expenditure, immediately affects those cells. So there's a story of something called MPTP, which back in the 80s, there was something they called the frozen addicts. So people who were using synthetic heroin that had a byproduct that had a mitochondrial toxin effect, very similar to what paraquat does. And with multiple administrations of it, this is kind of a high dose exposure. They develop the end stage equivalent of Parkinson's because of the death of those dopamine cells. And paraquat it's a similar mechanism. Clearly, the sort of dose response is nowhere near what we're talking about. But what we know from using MPTP as a chemical is that you can create a slowly progressive Parkinson's syndrome or the development of Parkinson's by an exposure now, and then the increase doesn't go away, or you're killing off some of those dopamine producing cells and there's no way to regain them. So that's one of the negative things about the brain is that it doesn't have a very good healing process. When you lose a type of a brain cell, whether it's trauma or it's toxic exposure, a stroke, there's no way to regain it. We can't grow back brain cells the way we do, say, muscle. Even heart is more forgiving with respect to an injury. So we understand that exposures to something which is neurotoxic can have an accumulated effect that we may not even see the results of until there's then the superimposed aging process. So you lose a certain portion of your dopamine cells and you're not going to feel any different. But now you have made those more susceptible to cell death over time and the normal aging process. We all lose dopamine cells as we get older, but unfortunately, some people's reserve might not be as good and they'll lose them quicker. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about the different studies suggesting a support of a paraquat association and what the relative proximities are and exposures are like. I just wanted to touch upon sort of my personal interpretation of these, because I know that a lot of people have talked about them already. So there is the agricultural health study, which is the one that often people will cite as being negative or null, where it does not show an association. So this is one of the largest cohort studies where agricultural individuals were followed over time and health outcomes were measured. And I think one of the challenges with interpreting it is it does show an absence of some type of a negative effect of paraquat in increasing risk of Parkinson's. But the study itself had less than 50% of the people who participated finish and tell us where they were in their health status afterwards. So there was lots of attrition over the time of the study. And that always questions whether or not there's some relative degree of a bias in terms of what the results are. So you have to be really careful interpreting it, even though it's a large study. And that said, the people who were most likely to not follow through with it were the people who were younger at the entry of the study, so would have been the longest of exposed, and somehow they just never made it to the point where they actually had a result that we could reference. So as important as cohort studies are, when they don't show an association, you have to look to see what's the validity of the result. Taking that same exact study, the same exact population, but then looking at people who were then confirmed to have Parkinson's disease. So a study called the FAME study, which was the farmers movement study. So they were looking at individuals. So they pulled people out of that study who got Parkinson's disease. And then they matched them to people who were the same age and did not have the same exposures. And when they did that, what they saw is that there was actually an odds ratio that went up to 2.5. So that's the benefit of that, is you have confirmation of an accurate diagnosis. When you have a cohort study, it's very hard to know, does the person actually have what they say they have if you don't have medical records? When you have a Parkinson's specialist measuring someone's exam and saying, yes, you have Parkinson's disease, and then being able to kind of link that in an accurate way. The other is that the way that they looked over the sort of relative exposures, they then sorted out gloved versus ungloved and other ways which there was a greater amount of exposure. Overall, 2.5 times the risk, so 250% increase. When they were ungloved, it went to actually like 300 to 400% increase. So the assumption is that everybody's going to do this in a protective way, but this is sort of the immediate effects of people who are using the paraquat themselves. California PEG study, which was a geolocation. So they just, as you know, California follows where their pesticides and herbicides are spread very carefully. And then they geolocated people who were diagnosed with Parkinson's. They took 400 of them and said, where were you located over time relative to the distribution of various herbicides and pesticides being distributed? That study, again, agnostic of whether or not the person knew they were exposed, just looked to see, were they exposed? Did they work in a farming occupation, or were they just in near proximity? And the more they were in it as an occupation, the higher the risk. The closer they were in proximity, the higher the risk. And so there's actually a very measured distribution that even in rural nearby, people were at higher risk of Parkinson's disease. So as we talk about the volatility questions and the like, it kind of argues that maybe there's some inaccuracy and that there is a contribution to it. So you have your nearby neighborhoods and you have your schools that are nearby or whatever it might be, that those people don't have any protective equipment on. And even if that's a small measured dose on a regular basis, it may be increasing their risk. That's what the data would suggest. So, and then the meta-analyses, I think, again, they're taking the pros and cons of all those studies, but they're putting them together, and it's not, it's done by a statistician, and they're doing it in a meaningful way, that they're looking to say what of these studies actually are performed in a valid way and can be pulled together as having the same outcomes. When they do that, that's the reference that people will use to say there's at least a 60% increase, potentially up to up to a doubling, right? So it's a twofold increase. The way I was thinking about it is the way we think about something like secondhand smoke exposure, right? So it increased, it's someone who doesn't have the choice of whether they're smoking or not. They're in near proximity. We've banned indoor smoking in a variety of different places. Yes, smoking is more common than paraquat use. That's absolutely true. But the relative risk of secondhand smoke for developing lung cancer is like a 30% increase, not 100% or 200%, but 30%. And even if you added cardiac disease in, if you added risk of stroke in, you're still a greater likelihood increase from paraquat exposure in proximity than you are from secondhand smoke. But we came to a conclusion that secondhand smoke inside is unsafe for people. So, anything else?
Yeah, thanks. Usually I like to ask questions that I have an idea of what the answer might be from the person I'm asking the question, and I have no idea. So I'm gonna ask you. You work with a majority of the patients that have Parkinson's in the state of Vermont?
Well, I certainly have colleagues that are seeing them as well.
And has there been a draw? Are these people from near orchards, or have they been exposed to paraquat? Do we know that? I mean, and if you don't, that's fair too.
Yeah, I think it's fair. So we don't have a registry. I have this conversation frequently where someone says, I grew up on a farm. And they say, we use herbicides, pesticides. They may remember what was used, what wasn't used. Or I live next to a farm and they ask me the question, they say, do you think that that's part of the contribution to this? And I say, based on what I can understand from the literature, maybe. Most likely it had some contribution. What we can do differently about it, nothing. You have Parkinson's already. So there's no way to turn back when you have it, right? So it's something that you really need to stay ahead of. We can't keep people from getting older. We can't change their genetics. What we can change is what negative environmental effects we might have.
Representative O'Brien?
Yeah, Doctor, I just wondered, besides paraquat, talking about environmental exposures, are there other things in our rural lives that also could contribute to?
Yeah, and I think so. The things that are sort of out there as considerations, naturally occurring manganese might be a potential contributor. There hasn't been a sort of map distribution of whether or not that's something which can be linked up with Parkinson's disease in any given state. Paraquat's certainly not the only herbicide or pesticide being used. There are other ones that have been associated with it. In terms of the one with the strongest evidence, this is the one. And I think if you look into the PEG study, which came out of California, it's clear that there's probably some additive effect of multiple exposures. And when you look at those maps, they overlap quite a bit. And the people who are at greatest risk had the greatest exposure to collective herbicides and pesticides, and sort of teasing out which ones are creating the most increase in risk is still under consideration, but it looks like paraquat so far is at the top.
Representative Boston?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know, I don't know if you're aware, but just within the last 2 weeks, there was a bill that went in about setting up a Parkinson's registry in Vermont.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
And Representative Burke?
Thank you, Chair. My question is along the same lines. Just curious if you have to know any studies that might have been looking at glyphosate versus paraquat in regard to Parkinson's. Sure, that comes up first in my mind, just because it's one of the more ubiquitous.
Correct. Yeah. So there's some less convincing but signal of evidence that glyphosate could also be a contributing factor.
And but you're saying that they've actually done the studies that have been done have specifically tried to target and isolate out paraquat versus all of these other potential chemicals.
Yeah. And I think the one that did it most cleanly is that it's by the author is Ritz is the senior author on it from California Valley.
That's
RITZ, and I can share that reference with you.
Yeah, just because you mentioned it and I didn't realize there had been a bill introduced, so we can let somebody else have an in-depth conversation. Are there registries, so the one that you're suggesting doesn't exist in Vermont, for other diseases, or in other states, are there registries for Parkinson's patients?
There are registries in other states. There are registries in Vermont for other neurological diseases. The one I'm most familiar with is ALS or motor neuron disease.
Representative Burke.
I had someone ask this question to me about Parapod. Usually we come on the coattails of California and their laws, but oftentimes it will not. Are you aware of any work that's been done in California, since it is such a large agricultural state and has high usage and even the studies coming out of here?
Yeah.
Are they looking at banning paraquat?
So I think there's 7 or 8 states, and I can't recall if California is one of them at this moment.
Right. Anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I think probably the most important thing is that there is an opportunity to identify something which that carries a potential genetic risk or environmental risk. And I think the evidence is strong enough in my mind. And again, I am clear about my own biases about the potential to want to eliminate any and all increased risk of Parkinson's disease, even if it's if it's an increase of 1% or 2%. In 100, so it increases one more person in 100. What's one more person in 100, right? Well, that's a decade plus of disability for someone, that one person, right? It's 100% for them. The amount of time and effort, I understand. Like again, I've never spread an herbicide or pesticide myself, and I understand the inconveniences of it, not having that opportunity to have what you want at your disposal. We deal with this in medicine all the time where I know this is the right medicine for someone, but CMS doesn't cover that medicine. So we're going to have to go with something else, and our toolbox has become restricted. So I feel that type of a sense on a day-to-day basis. But I think the really challenging thing is the people who are at the greatest risk are the people who are using it and the people who are their family members and their neighbors. And so it's not really me necessarily that's at risk or my family. It's the person who's choosing to use it. And I think that's a really tough situation where you don't want to tell people they're making a bad decision, but at the same time, they're making a bad decision potentially for themselves and also for their neighbors, right? And for their community. If indeed the volatility risk is right, you're theoretically putting your friends' kids at risk of having Parkinson's in the future, and you're putting your kids at risk and your grandkids if they're nearby. And so the magnitude of the effect, even if it's small, if it's preventable, it's hard to argue against it. In my, obviously I have my biases here. I understand this, right? I'm not in agriculture, but I understand Parkinson's really well. And I feel like there's a real opportunity here.
There's an economic cost to prohibiting the use of an herbicide or a pesticide to the agriculture part of our economy. I think what you're getting at is there's also an economic cost. There are personal costs, health costs, but also an economic cost to having to treat the population for any illness or disease.
Yeah, so it's the estimates in terms of relative lost wages, understanding that most people who are getting Parkinson's, they're just about in the end stage of their career or they're retired already. So not a lot in the way of lost wages. So most of it is healthcare costs. The estimate is $50,000 a year. If you extrapolate that over 10 years, it's $500,000. The end stages of the disease where you need long-term care goes up to about $90,000 to $100,000 a year in terms of the total cost of care. So you can very comfortably get to $1 million per person in terms of their overall life cost for Parkinson's.
Let's have one other hand up, Representative O'Brien.
I just wondered, since you've been studying Parkinson's so long, if you could speak to both sort of laboratory tests, but also in the field exposure to things like mammals that are exposed to it, songbirds, pollinators, if there's studies being done on the non-human.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to. Yeah. And it's interesting because in the absence of some type of a toxin, Parkinson's disease is a human condition. Other animals do not get Parkinson's disease.
Boy, thank you very much. Appreciate your testifying and coming in to speak to us. We've got Ledge Council here now and taking the liberty of switching agenda items. So we're going to have Bradley come up and walk us through some language for this bill. And while he's making his way over, you're welcome to stay, of course, thank you. I will say that most of the language that he's going to present to us comes straight from a bill introduced in the Senate this year, or this biennium anyway, with the same, or more or less the same intent, with a few modifications. So, and when we get to those modifications, Bradley will tell us. And this was at my direction. It's for the purposes of starting a conversation. We get to a point where we need to see language, and I think we're probably at that point. It doesn't mean that this is language that we need to collectively decide on, but it will give each of us an opportunity to say, I like this, or what could we do differently?
Bradley Shulman, Office of Legislative Counsel, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for an amendment to H 739.
Also on our web page.
And that is up. I just need to. My screen in order. Okay.
Bradley, sorry, I'm going to just say there's a lot of findings here. I think we can not spend a whole lot of time on each of them, but we will definitely want to come back to them if we proceed with conversations about the bill. And John.
Dave, what's the companion Senate bill with the language that we're using here?
Do you remember?
Oh, goodness. I just clicked off of it.
Let's have somebody else look that up.
Okay.
At least.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
And but this is an amendment to House Bill 739. And there are a few pages of findings here. I'll skim through these very quickly. Paraquat essentially is a herbicide that kills all vegetation. First introduced in 1964, regulated in by the EPA in 1978. And it is classified as restricted use pesticide. So a Class A pesticide to fit in our regulatory framework. About 72 countries have banned the use of paraquat, including the countries that are listed here. The European Union banned it in 2007. Some studies showed a link to Parkinson's, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Just a second, brother.
Does
Sorry.
paraquat kill or is it just burn back? I'm asking for technicality purposes. So if this goes forward, if it's correct.
Which one are we talking about?
The back in his findings up near the back up higher.
European.
Paraquat is,
Kills all vegetation that it touches.
yeah,
Okay, so let's flag that.
So I'm not sure if it kills it or if it just burns it back, because it doesn't get into the roots.
And
Yeah.
it doesn't go through bark like apple
Yeah,
trees.
it doesn't go through bark and, like Representative Burt, you have to spray multiple times to control the vegetation around those nursery trees. If it was glyphosate, I would feel you wouldn't have to spray near as much because it terminates the crop. Like you wouldn't use paraquat to terminate winter rye because it'll just burn it back and it will resprout and grow.
Yeah, and I think we've heard testimony to confirm that.
It's called
Yeah.
chemical mowing.
So let's flag that and we can figure out a better way to say that.
What line?
Line 10 and 11.
And I think.
Page 1.
Broadleaf,
Yes.
it kills broadleaf things, so like bark wouldn't be that, right?
Yeah.
And roots aren't that either, so it might.
Yeah, it burns back grasses and.
And I'm speeding through these, but
Another question here.
go ahead.
Need to slow it down, speeding through these zones.
I was going to welcome that actually. So yes, please do.
72 countries, you said, was it the entire European Union?
Yes.
So as a change, I would like to see that somehow incorporated, European Union in that. Number 4.
Number 4, okay.
Okay, yeah, so that would be,
It's
it would
not
be,
a country, you'd have to work it in.
it would be, yeah, it would be 72 countries, including the countries in the European Union.
Yeah.
Is Turkey part of the EU?
It's considered the border.
I wonder if it was part of the EU.
Okay. So,
And like I said, I'm speeding through these, but that doesn't mean you can't slow
yeah,
down.
my request.
Please do.
So don't
Yeah.
apologize.
Yes. And in 2021, as part of a product registration review of Paraquat required under FIFRA, the EPA issued an interim decision approving the continued registration of Paraquat for use in the United States. Despite multiple public comments objecting to approval and significant scientific evidence regarding the potential health effects of Paraquat exposure, multiple parties subsequently moved to challenge the EPA's interim decision authority and continued registration of Paraquat. In particular, the challenging parties contested the EPA's assessment of the increased risk of Parkinson's due to exposure from Paraquat from volatilization during use. So when you use it, it turns into a mist. In January 2025, after a petition from the EPA, a court allowed the EPA to withdraw its interim the interim registration approval for Paraquat, so the EPA may reconsider its initial conclusion concerning the potential for Paraquat to volatilize and to determine whether Paraquat continues to meet FIFRA's registration standard. This is the one I was asked to add by Chair Durkee. And so in October 2025, the EPA issued a memorandum titled Paraquat Review of the Volatilization Potential for Paraquat from Field Uses and determined that there is a greater uncertainty regarding the potential for Paraquat to volatilize than previously understood. The EPA concluded that more data is needed to understand the risk Paraquat poses to bystanders. So that report did not say that the increased volatilization means increased risk. It just found that there's increased volatilization when used, and therefore more data is needed to understand the risk. The EPA's reevaluation of the risk of Paraquat may take many years. Instead of waiting, the state of Vermont should ban Paraquat in order to protect Vermonters. So those are the findings. We're on page 4.
Sorry, just another comment. A couple in 6 and 7 references to studies by the National Institutes of Health. Do we know, are those actually done by the NIH, or are they research that's granted to other institutions? Just want to make sure that we're accurate, because NIH does its own research, but most of it's through grants. So that wouldn't be by the NIH, it would be funded by.
Yeah,
Just want to make sure we're accurate. We're going to put.
well, I think as we talked about before, findings ought to be easily defensible. So if somebody were to stand up on the floor and say, what studies are you talking about? Whoever's presenting the bill should be able to say, these are the studies, right? So good, thank you for pointing that out. If we're going to include them, we want to know what the studies were and how the funding, who did them,
And so with findings, like the last one seems like a change then, in that it's not factual, but it's saying we should ban it. So you can start editorializing in findings.
I think people can write any kind of a bill they want.
I just caution, with the lawsuits with Bayer and glyphosate and, over labeling and whatnot, we need to be careful what we put down is finding in fact, and want to make sure that it's true and undisputable.
Right, I
Yeah.
agree.
I will say, and so I think everyone's clear where this came from. Let's flag those two and try and stick with facts here. Yeah.
I would just say 13 sounds more like something that should be included in the floor report.
Yeah. Good, excellent.
The bill itself is short and sweet. We define paraquat, and so we use the chemical name. There's two chemical names here. And the chemical abstract service registry numbers for both of them. Those are the chemicals commonly referred to as paraquat. And we're amending statutes, Title VI, Section 1105D. We're adding the statute. I can show you where it is, where it would live in the in Title VI in a moment, but it lives with our neonicotinoid, would live with our neonicotinoid bans and the DDT ban. The prohibition: no person shall sell, use, or apply paraquat except when authorized by the Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Markets. Under subsection C. Subsection C is authorized use. Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Markets may authorize the sale, use, or application of paraquat upon a determination that a threat to Vermont crops exists that requires the use of paraquat and no other herbicide or class of herbicides would be effective in addressing the threat. So this is a little bit different from the neonicotinoid exceptions, and I'm sure the committee might want to discuss that. This doesn't give as much instruction to the agency on how to authorize and how to make those exceptions. So gives them more authority in that way. And then the reporting is a piece that I added at the request of Representative Durfee or Chair Durfee. And the Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Market shall report annually on all data regarding any use of paraquat authorized by this section. The report shall include the name of the person or entity authorized to use the paraquat, the amount of paraquat used, and the location where the paraquat was used. The Secretary shall submit the report to the House Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry, and the Senate Committee on Agriculture on or before December 15th of each year. This act shall take place on July 1, 2026.
So just to summarize, we've got all the findings, and there's a definition of what are we talking about, and then there's a ban, then there's a very general exception, and then there's the reporting. And I already have some thoughts on how we might change that reporting section. But let's see what other thoughts people have. Representative Nelson.
When farmers buy herbicide, they buy herbicide and they may not use it all up the year they buy it. Matter of fact, a lot of times they have carryover from one year to the next, and it's perfectly legal and allowed as long as they store it in a safe manner under lock and key. If this ban were to go in effect July 1st, 2026, there's a pretty good chance there'll be a lot of paraquat across the bay from my house.
So how do you?
So you need to give, maybe you start with, and I don't know where I lay on this yet, and I'm not gonna hide that for anybody, but while we're talking language, let's talk language. And then we can argue about the other stuff later, or not argue, debate the other stuff later. We can debate the other merits later, but you could start with a ban on the sale of July 1st, 2026, but allow people to use up their stock that they have. Thoughts, Greg?
So maybe I'd rather see that than just throw it in up by your house.
Yeah.
So something we might want to look at is safe disposal methods, and that's probably on the label. I mean, I don't know.
Oh, there's rules.
Yeah.
If people dare to follow rules, there's rules. Absolutely, absolutely. All that stuff has rules. They're very well laid out in our licensing requirement.
Representative Hurt.
So what exactly, I'm trying to understand what this might mean, Bradley, in line 16, last word being threat. Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Markets may authorize the sale, use, or application of paraquat. Determination that a threat to Vermont crops exists that requires what would be a threat in that case?
It would be up to the Secretary of Agriculture to determine. So this section does not use language such as agricultural emergency or environmental emergency. it gives the Secretary of Agriculture discretion to determine that. And so probably the broadest answer to your question there.
The secretary. But I don't know if, would not be able to properly maintain the vegetation underneath the young apple trees be considered like a threat to that operation, but I guess.
So the way that this is written, then the secretary would have fairly broad leeway and the authority to make a determination based on their discretion, more or less.
Yes, yes. And one other thing I would point out is that there's currently no rulemaking requirement in this bill to, require that the agency explain those terms or do a process to define those terms or define the use. That's currently not in the bill.
And that would be not unusual to have that in the bill, to have some thinking.
That is correct.
That happens. Yeah, around.
That happened with neonics. And could just as well happen here too.
Yeah.
I just wonder along those lines, sort of what's the appeal process for a farmer or orchardist, to go to the Agency of Ag and say, this crop's threatened, I need to use paraquat. Like, does that come up in the bill or is that just handled on a case by case?
So it should, in this bill, it's not defined. With neonicotinoids, the secretary, I don't believe has actually done rulemaking on that appeal process just yet. But broadly speaking, what happens when you have an appeal process is that any administrative agency determination is subject to the Administrative Procedures Act. And so an individual has a right to notice, a right to a hearing, and a right to appeal that hearing to a court if they disagree with the outcome of that hearing at the administrative level. So broadly speaking, an individual does have protections under the law. Those aren't necessarily spelled out here, and we can, as a matter of this bill, spell out those protections in particular. But broadly speaking, those would be the appeal rights without further rulemaking from the agency or what have you.
Because it seems right, it would come up from the farmer or orchardist, not, in this case, that it's not like, the Agency of Ag is going to be like, oh, there's some very long grass around trees and orchards. So
and that's exactly right. So the farmer would submit a request to the Agency of Agriculture to use paraquat, and the Agency of Agriculture would either approve or deny that request. And if they denied that request, they would appeal. So if they wanted, or they might not want it to
We
appeal.
don't need to put a mechanism in the bill for an appeal to be allowed or allowable.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
That is correct. That is correct. It would perhaps recommend some rulemaking for the agency to define the process might be helpful, or define a form. But that is also at the discretion of the committee.
Representative Nelson, but before I turn to you, I just wanted to flag and maybe have you explain a little bit. Bradley, you mentioned economic emergency and agriculture.
Yes. Yes. So agricultural emergency and environmental emergency are currently in the statute. And they're also broadly defined. But those were added to the statute for the neonicotinoids ban. And those exemptions require a finding that there is an agriculture or an environmental emergency. And I can pull those definitions up.
That's okay. We can save that for.
Okay, that's great.
I just wanted to say that those are two things that we have used before. They are much more specific or less broad than what we have here. Yeah. Virtually.
And this may not be the time, Chair, and if it isn't, we can discuss this later, but I have two other options that we could put in there sometime, but if this.
Yeah, no, let's hear.
One would be to use paraquat by permit only. An extra permit, you'd have to file with the Secretary of Agriculture to receive a permit specifying the place, the reason, the place, you know, a range of dates. I mean, try to pick one day because of weather, but a range of dates where you would use it. That's one option. The other option would be to ban it for use on agronomic crops for the use as a desiccant. You know, to dry soybeans, dry down potatoes, or other crops. In the world of, in my world of terminating cover crops, it is of no value. I mean, maybe there's some, but I'm not aware of it. And, you know, this would stop it being used on a wider scale. This would restrict its use basically down to orchards and viticulture. And I'm not, you know, the only thing I've learned about its use there is what we've taken as testimony, so I can understand why it works in those situations. And it's, you know. So anyways, that's what I got. Just something to consider.
Okay, great. Bradley, did you note both of those?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else, Representative
All
Bosler.
right.
I mean, another thing you do is a phase out too. I mean, to give orchardists and viticulturalists, you know, a couple years, a year.
Yeah,
to
yeah,
say that
yeah.
You need to be done by this point, just so in the IPM toolbox, they can start testing alternatives that might work.
Yeah, there's some of that, and, you know, we can ask them, what other tools do they have in their box? I am really leery of taking more stuff out of the toolbox. Agriculture's had enough. Profitability is struggle. And even with these high dense, orchards are going with, they're going to them to try to survive and feed America and the world.
Representative Burt.
I mean, I personally like the permit idea because in that process, there could be maybe a handout of some sort that was given by the, you know, when you get the permit, you apply for it, or before you receive it, you're made aware of, like, here are the potential risks with this. We do not normally recommend this chemical to be used, and here's why. And then that'll make it so it's a more informed decision as to whether or not to use it in the first place. Maybe they just suggest alternatives, but then say, after all that information, if you feel that this is the tool that you still need to use, yeah, we just want to know how much of it you used, where it went. That to me seems like a way of getting around some situations. Instead of having to go through the Secretary of Agriculture to do that, it would be it would be a process for somebody to have to go through. They have to know the risks that they're taking to do it, and then they inherently would be more careful in using it. It would limit the amount that it's used, but it would still allow it to be used without having to go through almost an act of Congress to do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
The agency permits special uses. Well, like they do for right of ways, that's a permitted use. They have to apply for a permit to do.
Well, the mosquito board, that's.
Or mosquitoes, exactly, you know, how long has it been since we've gone into mosquito wars? Been a while, but they don't do it up where I live, they make us suffer.
So we wouldn't be creating a brand new procedure here. It's already
Yeah,
done in other
Yeah.
instances.
yeah, and maybe you wanna tie the two together, but use by permit only, but stopping its use as on agronomic crops as a desiccant, because there are other things to use. And I can't believe anyone uses them on potatoes.
So just, I want to note here, and then we can see if there's any concluding thoughts, but in D, the reporting section, it actually wasn't my intent to have the legislature see everyone's name.
Okay.
Rather that the agency collect that usage data from everyone. And that could be accomplished in conjunction easily with a permitting process. If we were to go that route.
And so take out the name, just the amount used and location where it was used? Or do we
Yeah,
want
so-
what it was used for?
The agency shared data with us last week on a county basis, and it was useful on use by county, but it did not include all users. It was just commercial applicators essentially and municipal. So expanding that so that they're collecting all that information was my intent there. Representative Steve.
Thank you, John. You know, of all we've heard a lot of concerns and a lot of people handling transfer application. But the newest testimony, more recent, we heard it referred to vapor drift or quality. The vapor drift factor. Obviously, the licensed applicator is taking care of their immediate selves and or staff. But so when it comes to rules, counselor, you know, like you don't launch a space shuttle if there are crosswinds of X. Well, you can't apply it if it's a windy day and I know with apple orchards, when we were talking about the nicotinoid spray, it had to not be in bloom, but it also had to be when it was still, relatively still. So I don't know if that goes to the rules or what, but you know, that's a factor that I think we should consider.
I think that sounds like a good starting point for the conversation, not that we need to have, but about rule making, what, you know, the agency could consider.
And it's not on the label because they didn't consider that, and that's why their EPA is going back to study it.
We have general rules. There are general.
It's already
rules about
covered.
Wind drift.
Yeah.
But it's not specific to this for sure.
Well, I think also we heard the testimony the other day that, you know, you're supposed to be suited up and that those suits get hot quickly and, you know, maybe that needs to be part of the thought too. I'm gonna suggest, in the interest of keeping things moving here, unless somebody has anything else you wanted to say now, that Representative Brigham.
Don't the power companies and road that spray guardrails and that spray the interstates, and they publish in the paper when they're gonna do it and what they're using. You could go on something like that.
Yeah, we actually took some testimony about that a couple of weeks ago, and partly because we wanted to be sure that Paraquat wasn't being used in that particular application, and we now know that it's not. But yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, at some point you might say, Paraquat's going to be sprayed here. Let the public know. Let's wrap up here for now. We will, Bradley, we'll be in touch about any, and I know you've taken good notes, and we can be in touch about where we might want to go from here. And you don't even need to get up because unless you want to slide over and make room.
I do want to learn for Ellen.
We no longer have that extra seat to offer our witnesses.
Grab my paper for notes.
So now this is municipal regulation, okay?
So just to update you while Bradley's pulling up the next presentation, the conversation about municipal regulation of agriculture has been proceeding in the background and in the Senate Agriculture Committee. I know that they took testimony Friday on a proposal that's similar to what we're going to look at here that I've asked Bradley to draft. And they may have taken more testimony today. I'm not sure if they got back into it this morning or not. Just because we've got other committees that are very interested in seeing where we are, And we've only got now 10 working days before the crossover date. And we would need to actually pass something. I think there's some interest in having us get at least something out on the table, even if it's not the last word. So Bradley and I talked about it yesterday, a little bit end of last week, and then again yesterday. And again, what we're looking at is not intended to be my position or, but I think the committee's position is, but it is a position that is pretty close, I think, maybe to being one that all parties would agree to at the end of the day, if they had to compromise somewhere. So Bradley, if you want to bring that up, and I'll turn it over to you.
And I'm Bradley Shulman with the Office of Legislative Counsel. Here with
Ellen Chakowski, Office of Legislative Counsel.
And today we will do a walkthrough of House Committee Bill regarding municipal regulation of agriculture. So broadly speaking, this bill does propose to prohibit municipal regulation of agriculture activities that are subject to the required agricultural practices rule and the construction of farm structures, except for farming and farm structures in Tier 1A and 1B areas. That's the biggest change here. And we'll jump into going over the bill as such. So we have the findings and intent that hasn't changed very much, except to bring in the exceptions that we'll be talking about, farming and the construction of farm structures in Tier 1A and 1B areas. And now here's the big changes. So the statute that we've been discussing since the beginning of this year has been 24 VSA 4413. We've been discussing 4413D as in dog, and I will scroll down. So 4413D, a bylaw under this chapter shall not regulate. And that is what we've been discussing up until this point. Now, scrolling back up to make it confusing for everyone, but to scroll back up to page 2, line 10, we're discussing 4413A. This is a section of the same statute that permits the following uses may be regulated only with respect to location, size, height, building bulk yards, courts, setbacks, density of buildings, off-street parking, loading facilities, traffic, noise, lighting, landscaping, and screening requirements. And this is the important caveat here, and only to the extent that the regulations do not have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use. So we are putting some of the regulation of farming and farm structures into this piece. There will be a remainder that is prohibited in D below.
And this is existing language. So just partly for Representative Brigham, who's looking at maybe for the first time a marked up bill, anything that is underlined is new language that we're proposing, and anything that's crossed out is to delete. Anything else is what's already there in the law.
Correct.
Representative
And
Brumbaugh.
3 asterisks means that there's something there that they didn't put in that's existing law.
Yeah,
There's text there in existing law.
that you skipped over because it might not be.
For readability purposes, to skip it over because we're not changing it and it's not relevant to understanding what we're doing here.
Thank you for my benefit.
And so the first thing that we are adding is the what we have colloquially referred to as the right to grow food. It's not the right to grow food, but it is growing plants for food. So the cultivation or use of land for growing plants for food, for personal use, donation, or sale, including orchard crops, viticultural crops, and for maple sap. Or the raising, feeding, or management of poultry, excluding roosters, for personal use, donation, or sale. And then so this would permit municipalities to regulate these activities and just to the extent that that the regulations do not have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use. Okay. These are the pieces that are big changes to how municipal regulation of farming and farm structures has worked in the past. So what we're looking at is J, farming that meets the minimum threshold, and this is page 3, line 3. Farming that meets the minimum threshold criteria and the required agricultural practices rule, and is therefore required to comply with the required agricultural practices rule and the construction of farm structures, provided that the regulations pursuant to this subdivision A of this section. And so what this says is that a municipality may regulate by bylaw these activities subject to the following caveats here. So that these regulations only apply in a municipality's tier 1A and 1B areas established in accordance with 10 VSA 6034. That these regulations do not apply to farming that took place prior to July 1, 2026, or farm structures built prior to July 1, 2026. Do not apply to noise, smell, lighting, or hours of operation. And are limited to ensuring the safe ingress and egress of vehicular traffic and ensuring pedestrian safety, including regulated parking, signage, pavement markings, functional enclosure of livestock adjacent to roads, and if required, regulations related to trained personnel to manage vehicle movement on and immediately surrounding the premises, citing and setback requirements for newly created infrastructure, including farm structures, in a manner that does not create public safety concerns, including fire safety concerns to neighboring buildings. Or number 3, requiring that buildings open to the public be developed in compliance with the Vermont Building and Safety Code. The last piece that I changed here is I moved the definitions that were down in D up because they're referred to a little bit earlier. And then so you'll see those definitions moved up.
Got a question here.
Yeah. So this is granting the municipalities the opportunity to have a say in tiers 1A and 1B.
That's correct.
Okay, 1B, to me, 1A is well defined. 1B is growing out. 1B is encompassing farms that are on the edges of towns now. I find 1B problematic because of its growth. And I worry about agriculture in Heinsberg, in Addison, in Derby. I don't know what y'all have down there in Tunbridge, if you have zoning or planning or anything, if you're, or in other communities, I don't.
Right,
Royalton, and the Howe Farm. Of course, that's on the river that floods, so they're not gonna wanna build anything on it anyway, but. You know what I'm saying, no, I work, so. Even though that land's all been sold, the Percy Farm's been sold, the development rights, that's probably in a 1B, maybe they carved it out.
So I think that we definitely
More
will
so.
need to ultimately decide one way or the other. And I have added a couple of things here that are relevant to this discussion that I'll just flag, and then we can come back to it. But I think this will be a big question ultimately, but you just, I think, walked us through, Bradley, what I'm going to call the grandfather clause.
This is page 3, lines 9 and 10.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So if there's farming happening today in an area that's tier B, how is that going to be? So I mean, I'm not asking you that question, well, because I understand that question. But if somebody has a farm today and it ends up in tier B, we've talked about the scenario where they sell the farm, or they die and their kids take over the farm, or they change the kind of farming they do. How would those instances be covered down the road? Would a municipality be able to regulate them?
That is a good question. And this statute does not contemplate farm succession. And that would potentially be an open question, whether the exemption would apply to a successor in interest when selling the farm. So I don't have an answer to that question. I think changing the type of farming, this statute does not necessarily limit, like you have soybeans, right? And you change to corn or what have you, right? This statute does not say that limit it to a specific type of farming to give you that grandfathering piece. That's it. And happy to take more questions from the committee, but this might be a good time to draw on Ellen's expertise in terms of when someone is in a situation when you're regulated under subsection A, what kind of process that you need to go through to get permission to actually take on those activities and what that process might look like, or any kind of feedback or thoughts you may have here.
Sure. So 4413 is has multiple types of regulation that municipalities are required to use. A and D are very different. So currently under 4413A, including the rest of the list, the things that are covered by the 3-star ellipses, these are largely thought of as community land uses. And so currently municipalities have the authority to regulate those community uses through what is a modified conditional use review. So it sets up that the municipality can only look at these specific types of parameters on the development. But most of them do that through conditional use review, which requires the person who is going to be doing that use either for the first time or change of use. They're going to need to get a permit from the municipality, usually specifically from the appropriate municipal panel, like the Development Review Board. So they do have authority over that list of things specifically for those uses. Whereas with D is saying to the town, you do not have a role here, or you have a very limited role because these listed uses are protected from your oversight to a large extent. So for the things in A, those people would need to make an application to the town addressing those things listed on page 2, lines 10 through 12 and to 13. So that process usually involves them applying to the municipality. Usually they will work with the zoning administrator to determine if the application is complete. The administrator will then pass it on to the board or the panel, whichever that structure they have. The panel has to schedule warn a hearing and schedule a hearing on it within 120 days. The development review panel would then take up the permit and they can hold a public hearing on it, which includes notice provisions, and people come and have the permit presented to the panel. The panel reviews what the bylaws say in regards to these aspects. The panel will take evidence from other people who have relevant information, and then they will deliberate. Once they have deliberated, they need to issue a decision in writing on it within 20 days, but that process can also stretch out over multiple meeting cycles with the appropriate municipal panel. So that's quite a bit more procedure for those types of uses. One of the concerns I had is that this list in 4413A is pretty narrow compared to the other authority towns generally have under zoning. That's quite a bit more broad. But the list of things that are included in this draft, at least, aren't necessarily contemplated under that existing list of criteria. There's some other things that currently the town does not have oversight. So it does seem like you're creating a pretty specific individual type of review process for the municipality to go through with growing food and farming. And so I do just want to make sure that it's clear exactly what the municipality can do under what you're proposing, because it is not like what they were doing before for farming, but it's also not really like what they're already doing for other things under 4413.
And to give some context to the committee about why it's written in that way, the testimony and advocates about this issue have asserted that they want, in some ways, more protections to say that, okay, you're going in A, but still a municipality cannot regulate, do not apply to noise, smell, lighting, or hours of operation. And and then other advocates are considering things like, okay, well, you're in A, but we really want to limit it to these things. And so the bill in its current form is, as Chair Durfee said, a draft, and it is meant to kind of bring those ideas to the table, and to kind of balance those two things. But as Ellen pointed out, that is really unusual for this piece. And as we're saying that, we mentioned the ellipses, right? But you'll see in G and H and I as well, there aren't these caveats. And so that doesn't mean they can't have caveats, right? But we get into J, it's a different regulatory scheme that we're talking about that is unique to farming that meets agricultural practices and farm structures. And so it's a little bit of an uncomfortable fit here, but it is what we have.
So I think I'll just say that I don't think we're married to the place and statute where this sits at all. And so if it's an uncomfortable fit in the sense that it's in, a place where it's clunky or might be confusing in any way to interpret, let's figure out a better way to do it. And I also don't think that we want to create, even in, and I'm going to say tier one, or whatever it turns out to be, whatever, geographic areas, where we understand that we're granting the municipality authority that it hasn't had before, that we don't need, I don't think, to go out of our way to make it harder for farmers to farm by asking them to have to apply for anything or go through any permitting process. If the town says you can't put your driveway here, can we do that in a way that doesn't require the farmer to do a permit? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure because this is not our area of expertise, but we don't want to add an extra layer of complication here. I think we do acknowledge that ultimately we're going to have some areas, not sure what they're going to be, where municipalities do have some control that they don't currently or didn't have before the Taft Street decision. Yeah. Representative Boston.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly what we said today, one of my colleagues mentioned about this current draft doesn't ensure that succession would be protected if I passed on my farm to my children. It also doesn't necessarily protect if I'm running a chicken farm and then my kids decide they want to grow flowers or whatever. So it feels to me like maybe we should add language for that, because I think our intention is we want to protect as much as we can. So is it possible to name those two things specifically? I mean, it seems to me maybe like around 9 or 10 or something, it might make sense to fit in there.
Change of agricultural use.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't want it. We want to protect, even if they have a change of agriculture, if there's a farm and an
They
existing,
go from dairy to
Maybe
chickens or.
that's
Chickens
fine.
to
They can
vegetables.
keep that farming opportunity.
In line 9, could we solve this issue by saying do not apply to land where farming took place prior to?
Yeah, or
Or
parcels.
parcels, yeah.
That would work.
Okay, I think that might cover all of the different scenarios we were thinking about. Representative Burke.
Is there any way to ensure that, there's kind of two ways to go about it. The municipality can be on the I mean, I think it was alluded to, but a municipality could use this as an opportunity to be restrictive in its relation to farming, or it could use it as an opportunity to promote agriculture, right? So is there a way to have language in there that the intention is that the municipality do all it can to work with farms to promote agriculture versus restrictive?
Incentivize something.
You want to take a stab at that question?
No.
Okay.
I would need to think about that. I think one of the things I had also flagged that I didn't necessarily mention is that some 4413A does have some ambiguity in it, which has been interpreted differently by towns, and specifically with how they go about regulating location. And so the way currently, not talking about farming, but about existing things under the statute, some towns have interpreted that that means they only need to provide one location in their zoning where these uses are permissible. And so some towns have done that, where they have been very limited and restrictive based on this statute. So there is language in this statute that does allow towns to be less restrictive if they want to be. That authority does already exist. If you, again, want to be more specific for farming, you may want to consider just crafting a specific statute as opposed to trying to further narrow it here for one of the subdivisions.
It does say up further in this language we have here about that, the municipality has following uses may be regulated, and at the bottom, only to the extent that regulations do not have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use. So that to me is similar language to, to what I'm suggesting, but obviously different, where we say, with the intent of promoting, agriculture versus, over restricting.
Yeah, I think you
But
could
maybe
consider.
It would be a different, it's up to do.
So what this line, there is one of those caveats was added specifically for emergency shelters, defining that a municipality restricting their hours of operation would constitute interfering with their intended functional use. And so in that instance, it was very specific because that was the legislature had an intention of how do we protect shelters. So I think you already have been fairly specific, but I guess I would need to think a little bit more about it. But did you have?
I don't have anything to add.
We could put it in up in legislative intent and just at the beginning of the bill. Could we have a statement that doesn't undermine everything else we're trying to do?
I guess one of the questions is, do you want the municipality to have authority to fully deny a permit?
No, I think that the idea is that we're, I mean, we like the concept of you can put restrictions on it, but you can't functionally prevent it from happening.
And so currently this 4413A does allow the town to deny a permit application, and they do have to spell out though that they are not, how they have not interfered with the functional use.
Okay. Okay.
That's like an accessory on-farm business, right, has that. You can't ban it, but there are restrictions, right?
Yeah. So if we were to have a new section of statute then as a solution to a couple of these problems, would that be 4413E or would it be a whole new number? Maybe that doesn't matter.
I would probably give it its own number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you have enough information from us at this point to go back and do that, or are there still too many unanswered questions about our intent. I'm not sure we got through all of the bill either.
But yeah, I don't think we did.
You know, so one thing, I struggle with Representative Burt's question about intent to promote, right? Because I think by its nature, a bylaw is going to restrict, and I might be wrong about that. But I would imagine, at least in practice, a property owner is going to chafe at any bylaw that says you can only use your property in this way in this circumstance, even if those circumstances are quite broad. And so, I struggle with that, not because it's impossible, but because it feels like those are two often conflicting ideas. And then so I think Ellen's suggestion of a new statute that has some different parameters than what we've been working with might be the better way to get around that. We would just have to kick that around and need some time to do that.
Yeah, because there are some other ways that towns go about permitting development. I mean, the not going through a conditional use review, when towns have permitted uses which don't have to go through the full panel review, they can go just to the zoning administrator, which is a significantly quicker review process than going before the whole panel and having to have public hearings. So that is an option to have it be a more streamlined permitting process. But I do think you also could consider building in a requirement that they can't deny, but are allowed to attach conditions to fit within their bylaws.
Is some of this complicating because we moved it up to A? If we just put it back in D for the for one part or the other, the two parts being farming and growing food?
I think a level of complexity has been introduced by moving the farm structures up to A. And that's why, you know, I kind of, as I'm drafting this and then confirmed with Ellen earlier this morning, kind of feel like, you know, it's picking up some sand, right?
Yeah.
And maybe there's some things that we're not quite seeing. That's why I wanted to bring Ellen with her expertise to kind of help give us a more full picture of what it means to put this up here. I can move to D, so that might be a good transition to get to the rest of the bill.
Yeah, let's. I know we've been sitting still for a while, so I want to just so that everyone knows that we're not going to sit here forever, and we've got our next witness already, I think, joined us on a different topic. Why don't we let Bradley show us the rest of the bill, and then we can sort of have a conversation about what might happen next.
So this is section D that we're more familiar with, and then so farming that meets the RAPs and is required to comply with the RAPs. Our bylaw cannot regulate that activity except as set forth in subsection A of this section. Construction of farm structures as authorized under the RAPs, except as set forth under subsection A of this section. And then we have silvicultural practices and forestry operations as we ordinarily do. I mentioned before I moved the definitions up because that's where they're first used. Forestry operations was the only definition that he didn't move up. So I just kind of piggybacked it in its own little piggybacked it off of the list here. And then we have a study. And so the Secretary of Agriculture, Food and Market shall convene a stakeholder group to study and report on how to address municipal regulation of agriculture to better support farmers and their role in the agriculture economy. This group shall examine current and prospective municipal regulations of agriculture to identify how the regulations are currently working and whether there are shortcomings or challenges. The group shall also address how municipal regulations have affected or could affect existing farms, statewide and regional food security, farm succession, and the establishment of new farming operations, including whether municipal regulations have significantly restricted or functionally prohibited or could significantly restrict or functionally prohibit farming. The group shall examine whether municipalities should be prohibited or restricted from regulating the raising, feeding, or managing of livestock, including providing a model ordinance that would permit the necessary functions in raising, feeding, or managing livestock. And that report is due to the relevant committees on December 15th. And then this bill shall take effect on passage.
So allegedly, all the parties involved in this larger discussion support the idea of a study group. In addition to, solving the problem best we can at the moment. So this would set up that study group and ask it to report back to us. So that's there as a placeholder. Whether we actually end up needing that, I think is to be determined. So I'll just say one thing here, and then maybe we should take a quick break, although John, we can get your question in too. I want to have us think about all of the sort of exceptions that we've built in here with grandfathering, a list of what towns actually could regulate. Think about that when we're thinking about 1A/1B and whether there's enough protection to consider 1B. So that's something just to think about. And then, John, what was your thought?
I just had a thought about the succession language in that you might know when you have, a farm succession in current use that's agricultural, what's need to apply for a new. I know in farming, but I don't know what happens in agriculture, but I was thinking like we all support unanimously working lands in here. And it seems like current use is pretty seamless. If there's a,
Well, you gotta change the names on it. You gotta
Right.
refile.
yes, but
Even
it's
if it-
not, if they don't say, oh, you can't do that, you can't go
No.
from dairy to a Christmas
No.
tree farm. So if we could say, use some of that language, maybe it would.
Oh, yeah, that's what you're saying. You're gonna go from a dairy to Christmas tree.
Right.
Like you said, yeah.
You don't have to go through a huge process.
If I may, the distinction would be there's a grandfathering provision here, right? And so that's what we're talking about with change in use. So with current use, you can just reapply, right? Because that program is still applicable. But there's certain rights and protections that people under this bill would get if they are farming or have farm structures that are built on or before July 1st of 2026 that are no longer available after that date. And then so if the change in use happens after that date, it's not a matter of just applying again. I think there would need to be language saying that, specific language saying that a succession in interest, refers back to, when the farming first took place or something more artful than that. So I just want to make sure that's clear on that distinction.
And I would like it if there was a way to put in, if this is a working lands and going forward, it's still working lands, then it doesn't have to go through this permitting process or restricted permitting process, the DRB.
In other words, farming is farming. It doesn't matter if it's goats, chickens, cows, or carrots.
Right, exactly.
Or who's farming it?
Or who is farming.
Yeah.
If Michelle wants to go down and come up Derby and grow mushrooms.
There you go.
John?
I've been sitting on this question for a while.
Yeah.
Going back on the bottom of page 2, the sentence about cultivation of land for growing plants for food. Would this language allow any regulation of that at all? Like, could a municipality say, yeah, you can grow food, but not in the front yard, or it can't be visible from the street? Or would they be able to do that with this language? So they could impose significant restrictions with the language as written.
That is correct. So long as it doesn't have the effect of interfering with the intended functional use.
They can compose those restrictions today.
Under Taft Street, yes. Yeah.
Is it kind of back to the thing where if you want to have a garden and the only sun is in your front yard, this
Well,
doesn't help you at all.
Yeah, no, but I think this isn't necessarily. I'm thinking this isn't farming, so this is Taft Street. This
That's
is
exactly. Yeah.
I have.
Yeah, you're right.
Right.
I misspoke.
That's what I'm talking.
Yes.
Today, there's nothing in the law that prevents a town from saying you can't have a garden, period.
That is correct. So the law today says that towns say that it could be possible that town could completely prohibit a backyard garden.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is moving
Yeah.
against that, whether it's moving far enough or not.
Right, so I'm
is
just
the
pointing
question.
out
Yeah.
they could impose restrictions that would be very problematic to a lot of people.
Okay, we should stop. We need to stand up at the very least for 5 minutes. Bradley, while we're standing up, I'll just consult with you about,
Sounds good, sounds good.
and Ellen.
Yeah.
We'll take a break. John.
Sorry, I'm worried about how much they are gonna get that part, so.
Okay, this is
You
being,
gotta turn your mic off.
this is being live streamed.